Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in sophomore English. We turn our hymnals now to page 166, 167. We're going to read a really interesting little essay, another work of non-fiction and informative essay, Making History with Vitamin C by two writers, Couteur and Burreson. However, before we get to this essay, I just want to take us back for a second to page 153. So let's write this down at 2B. Our chief focus at the rhetorical level of reading at 2B is author's purpose, the main reason for writing, and of course the presentation of key theses writing, as well as the possibility of cause and effect. As we get into this discussion here, we'll be wanting to focus on that one as well. Hey, study the vocabulary on 166, obviously, to get ready for the assessment that's coming. Let's turn and look a little bit at our two writers. We'll begin, first of all, with Couteur, as well as Burreson. We'll look at them together. Authors of Making History with Vitamin C. Notice Couteur born in 43, Burreson born in 42. Born in New Zealand, Couteur has taught chemistry for more than 30 years. Burreson is also a chemist and runs a high-tech company. The two met in graduate school and have remained friends ever since. So let's write this down. Both of them come out of the world of chemistry, which is going to be, again, a fascinating study for us. Teaming up, the two friends decided to work together on a book to tell the stories of the fascinating connections between chemical structures and historical episodes. Each chapter in this book, Napoleon's Buttons is the name of it, examines a different molecule and its role in history. Some of you will read this with me and then will decide, you know what, I'm going to take a look at this Napoleon's Buttons in more detail. It takes its title from the chapter on tin. In extreme cold, tin will crumble. When the French leader Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, his soldiers' tin buttons disintegrated in the freezing air. We know about freezing air. That is really cold, isn't it? Many perished of cold in this defeat, some perhaps because of their tin buttons. The background for the essay you're about to read, The Age of Discovery. In the 1300s, Europeans began sailing the known world in search of spices and other goods to trade. As navigation improved, they traveled farther. These adventurers risked shipwreck and losing their way. They also risked scurvy. We want to write that term down at level 1. An illness resulting from a lack of vitamin C, as Making History with Vitamin C explains. By the way, did you know, these two chemists proposed that molecules help shape history. For example, they claim that the pursuit of sugar led to the slave trade and the Industrial Revolution. And of course, if you follow anything from our nutritionists today, they will usually say that, you know, sugar is probably not the most healthy thing for you. All right, let's turn now to Making History with Vitamin C. Hey, just like our study of Rachel Carson, let me remind you that as we as sophomores prepare here in a year and a half for taking our ACT, it makes sense that we would learn how to read scientific kinds of writing, prose, okay? So as we pay attention here, this is a different kind of reading. Can I say this out loud? The great thinker Mortimer Adler wrote a book a number of years ago called How to Read a Book. No kidding, it's an actual book. I recommend it to all of my students, where he made this interesting observation back in the 1950s. He said, it takes a different kind of reading approach to read a Shakespeare play, as opposed to reading a poem, as opposed to reading a short story, as opposed to reading a work of philosophy or history or science. I think Mortimer Adler in How to Read a Book was absolutely right. But I think all of those different approaches to reading subsume one thing, and that is conquering monkey mind. So let's see how well we do here. Try and pay very close attention. Again, our focus is author's purpose. You'll see on page 168. Do you see it right there on the left-hand side? Already you're being challenged with the first paragraph or two to answer, what do you understand as the author's purpose? Because here's the deal. When you take the ACT, you are provided in the reading section of the ACT. By the way, always the last section of the ACT. Why? Because that's the brain drain part of the test after you have been crushed mentally They then give you the reading, and we're going to find out just what kind of reader you are at the end of 2.5 hours of reading and doing the math, doing the science, everything else. But there's always a science passage to be read. And you want to pay attention in your approach here to how well you're able to focus, right? Conquer monkey mind. The key, of course, is to quickly get into that whole attitude of curiosity. Wow, this interesting thing about vitamin C. Don't start the essay by going, oh, seriously, this has got to be the most boring topic imaginable. Rather start by asking, what can they teach to me that will make this an interesting study? Let's take a look now. Here we go. Follow along. Let's see how well we do, all right?
Making History with Vitamin C by Penny Le Couteur and J. Burreson. The age of discovery was fueled by molecules of the spice trade, but it was the lack of another, quite different molecule that almost ended it. Over 90% of his crew didn't survive Magellan's 1519 to 1522 circumnavigation of the world, in large part due to scurvy, a devastating disease caused by a deficiency of the ascorbic acid molecule dietary vitamin C. Exhaustion and weakness, swelling of the arms and legs, softening of the gums, excessive bruising, hemorrhaging from the nose and mouth, foul breath, diarrhea, muscle pain, loss of teeth, lung and kidney problems. The list of symptoms of scurvy is long and horrible. Death generally results from an acute infection such as pneumonia or some other respiratory ailment, or even in young people, from heart failure. One symptom, depression, occurs at an early stage, but whether it is an effect of the actual disease or a response to the other symptoms is not clear. After all, if you were constantly exhausted and had sores that did not heal, painful and bleeding gums, stinking breath and diarrhea, and you knew that there was worse to come, would you not be depressed too?
All right, let's pause, put it at level 1 really quickly. Again, I'm trying to teach you how to annotate as you read. So at level 1, you can already write it down. Notice we've made 2 observations already. 1, that this is going to be an essay that specifically will talk about the need, the importance of vitamin C. 2, more interestingly, we're going to talk about scurvy. Now I say interestingly because although it's really disgusting, it's also very interesting. Notice the list of symptoms. Yuck, really nasty stuff, right? And the goal for us is to try and get a sense now of the history of scurvy as it relates then to this understanding of vitamin C and the importance of vitamin C. There isn't any doubt that by the end of an essay like this, we're going to be camping at level 3B, and we're going to be asking some personal questions about the importance of vitamin C in our own diet and the whole notion of how important nutrition and diet actually is for us. Let's go ahead now and continue. We're going to get a little bit of a history lesson. Notice we got scientists talking history to us, which is kind of cool. Let's pay attention. Here we go.
Scurvy is an ancient disease. Changes in bone structure in Neolithic remains are thought to be compatible with scurvy, and hieroglyphs from ancient Egypt have been interpreted as referring to it. The word scurvy is said to be derived from Norse, the language of the seafaring Viking warriors who, starting in the 9th century, raided the Atlantic coast of Europe from their northern homelands in Scandinavia. A lack of vitamin-rich fresh fruit and vegetables would have been common on board ships and in northern communities during winter. The Vikings supposedly made use of scurvy grass, a form of Arctic cress, on their way to America via Greenland. The first real descriptions of what was probably scurvy date from the Crusades in the 13th century.
Page 169.
Scurvy at sea. In the 14th and 15th centuries, as longer voyages were made possible by the development of more efficient sets of sails and fully rigged ships, scurvy became commonplace at sea. Oar-propelled galleys, such as those used by the Greeks and Romans, and the small sailing boats of Arab traders had stayed fairly close to the coast. These vessels were not seaworthy enough to withstand the rough waters and huge swells of the open ocean. Consequently, they would seldom venture far from the coast, and supplies could be replenished every few days or weeks. Access to fresh food on a regular basis meant that scurvy was seldom a major problem. But in the 15th century, long ocean voyages in large sailing ships heralded not only the age of discovery, but also reliance on preserved food.
All right, let's pause for a moment. Two observations. The first one, notice at 2B. Do you see your heading here on page 169, Scurvy at Sea? You want to put that heading at level 1. And then we want to make sure we put several things at level 1 underneath this heading. By the way, the second heading, notice, is over on 173. We've got our second heading there. And as we flip through to the very end of the essay, notice, those will be our two major headings, okay? So we want to put that at level 1. By the way, that's always significant for us. Anytime we pick up our reading, especially in the sciences and in the maths, we're always paying attention to the way in which the writing is typeset. In other words, the headings that are utilized. Number 2, let's go ahead and put this down at level 1 as well. Notice that in the 14th and the 15th century, as we begin to invent ships, humans begin to invent ships that can go further and further out into the ocean, that's when we increasingly begin to see greater examples, cases of scurvy. Why? Because obviously we're getting further and further out to sea, so we don't have the opportunity to put into port where we can then get certain kind of foodstuffs that will appropriate the vitamin C that's necessary. Again, notice the interesting way in which our writers are going to take us on a little history lesson. Dude, I thought we were talking about science. Yeah, but it's all interrelated. I mean, think about that. Anytime you do math, you're doing history. I mean, if you're doing Pythagorean's theorem, you're talking about Pythagoras, which is, of course, a pre-Socratic. That is to say, you're doing history. Any time that we're in a science class, we're doing history. That is to say, somebody had to kind of invent the ideas, discover the ideas that were being presented in science. All right, let's go to work with it. That is to say, what happens when we can start sailing for long distances out in the middle of the ocean?
Bigger ships had to carry cargo and arms, a larger crew to handle the more complicated rigging and sails, and food and water for months at sea. An increase in the number of decks and men and the amount of supplies inevitably translated into cramped sleeping and living conditions for the crew, poor ventilation, and a subsequent increase in infectious diseases and respiratory conditions. Consumption, tuberculosis, and the bloody flux, a pernicious form of diarrhea, were common, as no doubt were body and head lice, scabies, and other contagious skin conditions.
Yuck, right?
The standard sailor's food did nothing to improve his health. Two major factors dictated the seafaring diet. Firstly, aboard wooden ships, it was extremely difficult to keep anything, including food, dry and mold-free. Water was absorbed through wooden hulls, as the only waterproofing material available was pitch, a dark-colored sticky resin obtained as a byproduct of charcoal manufacture applied to the outside of the hull. The inside of the hull, particularly where ventilation was poor, would have been extremely humid. Many accounts of sailing journeys describe incessant dampness as mold and mildew grew on clothing, on leather boots and belts, on bedding, and on books. The standard sailor's fare was salted beef or pork, and ship's biscuits, known as hardtack, a mixture of flour and water without salt that was baked rock hard and used as a substitute for bread. Hardtack had the desirable characteristic of being relatively immune to mildew. It was baked to such a degree of hardness that it remained edible for decades.
Page 170.
But it was extremely difficult to bite into, especially for those whose gums were inflamed by the onset of scurvy. Typically, ship's biscuits were weevil-infested, a circumstance that was actually welcomed by sailors as the weevil holes increased porosity and made the biscuits easier to break and chew. The second factor governing diet on wooden ships was the fear of fire. Wooden construction and liberal use of highly combustible pitch meant that constant diligence was necessary to prevent fire at sea. For this reason, the only fire permitted on board was in the galley, and then only in relatively calm weather. At the first sign of foul weather, galley fires would be extinguished until the storm was over. Cooking was often not possible for days at a time. Salted meat could not be simmered in water for the hours necessary to reduce its saltiness, nor could ship's biscuits be made at least somewhat palatable by dunking them in hot stew or broth. At the outset of a voyage, provisions would be taken on board: butter, cheese, vinegar, bread, dried peas, beer, and rum. The butter was soon rancid, the bread moldy, the dried peas weevil-infested, the cheeses hard, and the beer sour. None of these items provided vitamin C, so signs of scurvy were often evident after as little as 6 weeks out of port. Was it any wonder that the navies of European countries had to resort to the press gang as a means of manning their ships? Scurvy's toll on the lives and health of sailors is recorded in the logs of early voyages. By the time the Portuguese explorer, Vasco da Gama, sailed around the southern tip of Africa in 1497, 100 of his 160-member crew had died from scurvy.
Wow, huh?
Reports exist of the discovery of ships adrift at sea with entire crews dead from the disease. It is estimated that for centuries, scurvy was responsible for more death at sea than all other causes, more than the combined total of naval battles, piracy, shipwrecks, and other illnesses.
Amazing stat, right?
Astonishingly, preventives and remedies for scurvy during these years were known, but largely ignored. As early as the 5th century, the Chinese were growing fresh ginger in pots on board their ships. The idea that fresh fruit and vegetables could alleviate symptoms of scurvy was, no doubt, available to other countries in Southeast Asia in contact with Chinese trading vessels. It would have been passed on to the Dutch and been reported by them to other Europeans as, by 1601, the first fleet of the English East India Company is known to have collected oranges and lemons at Madagascar on their way to the east.
Page 171.
This small squadron of 4 ships was under the command of Captain James Lancaster, who carried bottled lemon juice with him on his flagship, the Dragon. Anyone who showed signs of scurvy was dosed with 3 teaspoons of lemon juice every morning. On arrival at the Cape of Good Hope, none of the men on board the Dragon was suffering from scurvy, but the toll on the other 3 ships was significant. Despite Lancaster's instructions and example, nearly a quarter of the total crew of this expedition died from scurvy, and not one of these deaths was on his flagship. Some 65 years earlier, the crew members on French explorer Jacques Cartier's second expedition to Newfoundland and Quebec were badly affected by a severe outbreak of scurvy, resulting in many deaths. An infusion of needles of the spruce tree, a remedy suggested by the local Indians, was tried with seemingly miraculous results. Almost overnight, the symptoms were said to lessen and the disease rapidly disappeared. In 1593, Sir Richard Hawkins, an admiral of the British Navy, claimed that within his own experience at least 10,000 men had died at sea from scurvy, but that lemon juice would have been an immediately effective cure. There were even published accounts of successful treatments of scurvy. In 1617, John Woodall's, the surgeon's mate, described lemon juice as being prescribed for both cure and prevention. 80 years later, Dr. William Coburn's Sea Diseases, or the Treatise of Their Nature, Cause, and Cure, recommended fresh fruits and vegetables. Other suggestions, such as vinegar, salt water, cinnamon, and whey, were quite useless and may have obscured the correct action. It was not until the middle of the following century that the effectiveness of citrus juice was proven in the first controlled clinical studies of scurvy. Although the numbers involved were very small, the conclusion was obvious. In 1747, James Lind, a Scottish naval surgeon at sea in the Salisbury, chose 12 of the crew suffering from scurvy for his experiment. He selected men whose symptoms seemed as similar as possible. He had them all eat the same diet, not the standard salted meat and hardtack, which these patients would have found very difficult to chew, but sweetened gruel, mutton broth, boiled biscuits, barley, sago, rice, raisins, currants, and wine. Lind added various supplements to this carbohydrate-based regime.
Page 172.
2 of the sailors each received a quart of cider daily. 2 others were dosed with vinegar, and another unfortunate pair received diluted elixir of vitriol, or sulfuric acid. 2 more were required to drink half a pint of seawater daily, and another 2 were fed a concoction of nutmeg, garlic, mustard seed, gum, myrrh, cream of tartar, and barley water. The lucky remaining pair was issued daily 2 oranges and 1 lemon each. The results were sudden and visible, and what we would expect with today's knowledge. Within 6 days, the men who received the citrus fruit were fit for duty. Hopefully, the other 10 sailors were then taken off their seawater, nutmeg, or sulfuric acid regimes, and also supplied with lemons and oranges. Lind's results were published in a treatise of scurvy, but it was another 40 years before the British Navy began the compulsory issue of lemon juice. If an effective treatment for scurvy was known, why wasn't